It's been an interesting ride in real estate over the last 5 or 6 years. We've seen prices escalate. We've seen more than double, triple in prices, and then we've seen the prices settle down. But even now, as the prices have stabilized, we see that over the last 5 years, residential real estate in the Niagara area is almost double what it was 5, 6 years ago. And parallel to the price of acquiring a property, rents have gone up similarly 80 to 100% compared to what they were 5, 6 years ago. And when I say that, but that's not in every case. In some cases, they're way below market rent. They haven't risen along with prices and values of property. And the reason for that is rent control. The legislation that was in place some years ago was the Tenant Protection Act. And under the Tenant Protection Act, a landlord would be allowed to raise the rent, whatever the government set, on an annual basis once a year. And that would be the case whether a tenant moved and a new tenant moved in or not. That would be the locked-in legal rent for that unit. Under the Replacement Residential Tenancies Act, when a tenant moves, you're allowed to set market rent, whatever you want. So when a tenant is in place, you get the maximum amount the government sets, and it's always way below cost of living, but you get an allowable increase, and if you don't use it, when the tenant moves, it's open season. And for that reason, a lot of landlords elected under the new legislation to not raise rent. And their reasoning was simple. They said, if I lose a tenant, it's going to cost me a lot of money. If I lose a tenant, first of all, there's the problem of showing it. I've got to show it when he's moving out, and there's boxes and junk everywhere. It doesn't show well. I've got to mesh with his schedule. And the chances are I'm going to lose a month or two rent in between. I'm not going to rent it out the day he leaves. But in addition to that, I'm going to have expenses. I'm going to have to shampoo the carpet or replace the carpet. I may have to paint the unit. And so there's a lot of reasons why I want the tenant to stay there rather than move. And I'm afraid if I give him a notice telling him his rent's going to be increased, even if it's a minimal amount, it's going to make him stop and think and maybe reevaluate his position. I don't want to take a chance on losing him, so I'm just not going to raise the rent. The problem is some tenants never move. If I look at my past rental experience as a landlord over a number of years, the one area that I feel I really made a mistake was not raising the rent every year. I've got tenants who've been with me 18, 20 years, and their rent is about half market rent. Even if I had raised it every year over the last 5, 6 years, with a compounding effect, I might have raised the rent 10%, but the market rent went up 100%. I would still be way behind. Because of this, we get a lot of new buyers who buy investment property asking the question, how do I get rid of a tenant so I can increase the rent? And the simple answer is, you can't. Now, if you're buying a property that's owner-occupied, owner's moving out and you're going to rent it, no problem. Set the rent whenever you like. If you're buying a property and the tenant elects to move out, no problem. Set rent whatever you want. But if you're wanting to change the rent to market rent and there's an existing tenant there, you can't just give them notice. Now, there is provision under the Act to evict a tenant because you need it for your own personal use or your immediate family. And the legislation is pretty specific. Immediate family means your parents, your children, or a spouse. And so a lot of people, when they're acquiring a property, get the seller to issue a N12 notice saying that the buyer who has a beneficial interest requires the property for himself and you have to vacate. And that means that you give the tenant 60-day notice and you have to also give them a consolation prize of 1 month rent. The problem is, if the new buyer doesn't in fact move a family member in, or just for 3 or 4 months and moves them out, that existing tenant can come back and challenge. He's got up to 24 months to challenge it. If he challenges it successfully, the owner who gave the notice, the owner who was selling, can be fined up to $50,000, excuse me, or $250,000 if he owned it in the name of a corporation. And so they're going to want the new owner to sign an indemnification taking over that responsibility. And as I say, the tenant who comes back also has the right to rent the unit at market rent, at the rent he was paying, not at market rent. So it's a very dangerous road to go down to give the tenant notice to vacate because you want to raise the rent. But a lot of people have done that. Be very, very careful about doing that. There's another reason, though, why I'm going to encourage you to get on the habit of raising the rent every year. Even though it's a long way from keeping abreast of inflation, the legislation requires you to pay interest on any deposit you're holding. And most landlords, when they rent, charge first and last month's rent. So every year, that last month's rent attracts interest. And the interest is set at whatever the legal increase is for the rent. That's the interest you pay on the last month's rent. So if you increase it every year, then the last month's rent they paid when they moved in grows because of the interest, keeping exactly tied in with what you're raising it. And when they leave, whatever the rent is, that's what the last month rent has grown to, and you don't owe any interest. It saves a lot of problem with accounting, and if you don't raise the interest rate or the rent every year, then you're going to be caught paying interest and calculating on an annual basis. It just makes a lot of sense for those two reasons. I hope that makes sense. It isn't a solution totally, but it helps, and it'll help you avoid some pitfalls moving forward. Thank you very much for investing the time and watching this video. I look forward to talking to you again next week.